Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Let's Talk SU, a social commentary show dedicated to bringing to light the many injustices that occur across America on a regular basis. Our purpose for the show is simple: to enlighten, educate, and create awareness. In this episode, which is our final episode, we will break down cultural appropriation and all that it entails. We would like to disclaim that language used on this show can be perceived as offensive, so viewer discretion is advised. I'm your host, Gracyn Doctor, and today we're speaking with Maria Trivelpiece. So let's talk SU. So let's just jump right in first. I wanted to start by defining what cultural appropriation is. So cultural appropriation is the use of a culture's symbols, artifacts, genres, rituals, or technologies by members of another culture. Cultural appropriation can happen among any group of people, but it does typically involve a power dynamic where a dominant group takes from a culture that is systematically oppressed. Culture is defined as the customary beliefs, social forms, or material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. There are three ways that we typically see culture appropriated: through subject appropriation, when an outsider takes something from a culture different from their own and uses it as the subject of a work of art. There's content appropriation, which is when an artist takes products of a culture different from theirs and uses it in the production of their own work, or they take the style of another artist from a different culture and uses it as their own. Then there's object appropriation, when something sacred, like a sculpture, is taken and now in the possession of somebody from a different culture.
So you talked about just all these different things of taking. So I think like this common theme that we've been seeing so much with cultural appropriation and with the research and just from experiences, that's exactly what it is. It's taking and it's stealing from someone else. So I think that it's very important that we even have discussions that we're about to have like this, because stealing isn't okay by the means of law. So why should it be okay in terms of just because there's no rule against it? Why should we not be aware of it, and why we need to have conversations like we're going to have?
Right. And I feel like what's really important is the fact that the things that are normally taken are things that are really sacred to the culture that it belongs to. You know, there are certain things there are certain reasons why people do things, like hair, for example, or wear certain things, and they mean certain things. And so when people who don't belong to that culture takes that and then uses that for their own benefit, it's kind of like dissing the culture that it belongs to.
And I think that people, at some points, they don't even realize that they're doing that, but that's not an excuse. Ignorance is never an excuse for anything. And I think that with the common sense that most of us have, we should be able to know when we're taking something from someone that means a lot to them. And we should have the decency to at least sit down and talk about it, which is kind of what we're going to discuss later on, is how important it is to appreciate a culture and not just appropriate it.
Yes. So we've seen culture appropriated numerous times in the media, especially in the last few years. A really big thing that has happened, honestly, probably throughout all of our lives, is wearing Native headdress or attire during Halloween, or dressing up in something, or dressing up as what you may perceive as something from another culture. That's cultural appropriation. We've seen Kim Kardashian wearing cornrows and calling them Bo Derek braids. That's cultural appropriation. Like braids are something that's very sacred to African Americans, and then to take them and also give them your own name for them just shows that you're not aware of what the historical context is behind the hairstyle. Even Pharrell wearing an indigenous headdress on the cover of Elle magazine. Like Pharrell might be African American, but he still isn't indigenous. And so to wear something as sacred as a headdress on the cover of a magazine, it's still considered cultural appropriation. And I feel like that's really good to say, because I don't want people to believe that cultural appropriation is just white against black or black against white. It can happen across any race or ethnicity of people.
And I think you mentioned a bunch of great things just right in those examples that you give. And kind of like breaking it down, starting with Halloween, I feel as though it's become so normalized that people don't even realize what they're doing. So there are people who dress up as Native Americans. I know, like the first thing that comes to mind for me is just like Disney movies, like Pocahontas or Mulan, and how many little kids like dress up as that for Halloween. So I think that from a very young age, we're shown that, oh yeah, we can do this, but we're not ever understanding like that this isn't okay. So I think that if we're going to change the conversation around cultural appropriation, that we need to be able to like learn from a younger age. And we'll talk about that more, as we said. But another thing that you brought up is this idea that cultural appropriation isn't just between like white versus black. It's literally all cultures and how we need to respect that. And the thing that comes to mind for me is, I know we talked about this earlier, but when I played softball, a big thing for us to do was wear cornrows in our hair. And I just didn't even understand like what I was doing. So what would you suggest for someone who might be in a situation like that? And how could I go back and do that better? Because I did it and I was culturally appropriating without even realizing. So what could I do to kind of be better for everyone?
Yeah, so I think that's a really great example because that's something that we see regularly all the time. You know, something as simple as braids. Everyone puts in braids, everyone wears them. But I feel like the really important part of that is that you recognize that you were cultural appropriating. You know, you were taking something from a culture that wasn't yours. And so to me, that's the first step. It's acknowledging, you know, that this isn't a part of your culture. This isn't something that your group of people do regularly. And so I think once you begin to see that, then you can begin to educate yourself and find out, you know, like what is the history behind braids? Why are people so offended when I wear braids? You know, like where does that come from? Because that's also really important to figure out as well. It's not just, you know, me not wanting you to wear it. It's because of what braids represent in my culture. Also, I think the important thing is too that something like braids, when you take braids and you wear them, it's important to recognize that Black people who wear braids all the time, we get looked down on for wearing braids. You know, we're told that they're not professional or, you know, that it's too ethnic. And so that's the other part of it too, recognizing your privilege in that and how you may be seen differently when you do wear braids, for example, versus when a Black person wears braids. So I don't think it's anything, you know, of course, that you can go back and do, but now going forward, you are aware, you're educated, and showing that appreciation to the culture.
And that kind of leads me to my next question. So say now I'm going to play a game, right? So I have talked with you about this. I understand now like where braids come from and this cultural significance that it has, and how, like you said, that I have the privilege to wear it maybe without being like looked down upon. So is it still okay that I enter the game and play with the braids? And if so, how do I relay that message that I kind of did all this research and like really tried to appreciate what I'm doing to maybe other people on the field, in the stands? Because I can't like stop in the middle of the game and be like, oh wait, no, I checked on this, like it's fine. So like, what would your suggestion kind of be in a situation like that?
That's a really great question, and it's a difficult one to answer because I personally think that this is something that probably varies among different people, among different Black people specifically. But I will say that I think that if you are somebody who lives in the light of consciousness, if that makes any sense, you're aware of the systematic oppressions that are against Black people, and you're aware of the history for why we even wore braids in the first place. If you are friends and actually in the circles of Black people, I feel like those kind of things show, or you know how they say like show, don't tell, or like actions are better than words.
Yes.
I feel like those actions kind of show that you are appreciating the culture because you're aware of the culture and you're aware of the things that the culture goes through. there isn't really much you can do when you're on the field. Like you say, you know, you can't yell out to everyone like, I know, guys, I'm aware of what's going on. But I think that it's just something that you have to know personally, and that you have to make sure that you do the work for personally, because you wouldn't want to be put into a situation where somebody comes and questions you, like a Black woman comes up to you and questions you about your braids. Right. You would want to be able to let her feel comfortable that you are aware of what the braids signify and what they mean, and you know that you're not appropriating culture but appreciating culture.
And that kind of like brings us to like the next point that we were thinking about, just appreciating, how to appreciate and not appropriate, and why in the first place do people not know that they're appropriating to begin with? Because I have to admit that, like, I'm 23 years old, you know, and I have heard the term cultural appropriation, but until I actually sat down and like learned what it was, I didn't actually know. So I've definitely committed offenses throughout my life, like just the braids being one example, or I think I was Mulan as a kindergartner, you know? So how come this isn't talked about more? Like, what do you think can be done to make it talked about more?
So before we really dive into that question, I think it is good to break down appreciation versus appropriation. So we've talked about what appropriation is. The difference with appreciation is, like we've stated before, you know, becoming familiar with the culture, getting to know people in the culture, actually hearing people and having those conversations with people who are in that culture. So you can then develop a level of appreciation for the culture. Because once you begin to appreciate and know about things in the culture, you then know what you can and cannot do. You know what things are off limits, and you know what things are there, what things that people are welcoming you to participate in. Right. And so I feel like once you begin to do that work, then you'll be able to see it's almost like an awakening kind of, you know, because you're educating yourself, and the more you know, the better you can then be, you know?
No, I totally agree. Yeah, that like, I feel like just now, like, you know, we've been talking for however many minutes, like I already feel like I'm like learning more, you know what I mean? And I think we're always learning more, like just in everything in life, but I think this is really important to kind of constantly be experiencing and understanding and searching for more answers.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. And I think that's the important thing. I think that's why you might not hear or might not believe that it's something that's talked about. You know, if you really listen to cultures or marginalized groups of people, for example, if you really get to know people of those cultures and communities and ethnicities, then you will begin to hear the things that we talk about all the time. You know, you'll begin to hear about our experiences and the things that are done that hold us back and that oppress us. And by becoming aware of those things, you then educate yourself, like we've been talking about the whole time. You then educate yourself and know the things that are and are not appropriate. So then when you see things on TV, for example, like when you are watching Milan with your child, you're then as a parent able to explain to them how, yes, this is something that is teaching us about a culture, but it isn't something that we can repeat or something that we can replicate on our own because we don't belong to that culture. So I hope I'm making sense. I hope I'm being clear. I just feel like with awareness and education, then you become more aware of the things that you can and cannot do, and you become more aware of the things that, or when you're kind of towing into appropriation. Also, by getting to know these people, you can just simply ask, you know, you can simply ask, is this appropriate? Or what does this mean? And if it's your friend, if it's somebody who you have a close relationship with, there's no problem in explaining it to you, because that's how we all learn and grow.
Right. And like you said, just like learning to appreciate it and talking with your close friends. So you said towing that line of like appreciation and appropriation. What are some other differences and like, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess differences and just differentiating between the two. How would you go about that? Like what, through your research and just your life, how have you experienced the difference between the two?
So I'm sorry, just to be a little clear, differentiate the difference between like appropriation and appreciation.
Yeah.
So, I think for me personally, it would have to be, gosh, man, that's so difficult because it's very easy, you know, as Black people or people of color or any marginalized group of people to see something that is being done from your culture or taken from your culture and someone else is now doing it. And it is hard not to immediately feel like you're being appropriated or like your culture is being stolen from, especially when you've had no communication with this person. You know, you don't really know where they're coming from. You don't know if they're aware. So I feel like it's really difficult, especially in the public eye, you know, especially when it's somebody who is like a celebrity or somebody who does have a lot of power or money. You know, it's really hard. So I feel like I can't help but feel like the more you know about something, the less likely you are to do it. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just feel like if more people were culturally aware of things or, you know, did take the time to educate themselves on culture, simply education, like not even going into like getting to know people yet, but the very basic, which is reading, like getting online and reading. Once you learn about things, I'm inclined to believe that you won't do it, you know, like no matter how many times even though I don't want to, but for example, no matter how many times I may want to wear a native headdress, if I know how sacred that is to Indigenous people, I would never do it.
Right.
You
And
know, so I don't know if that really answers the question.
no, it definitely does. No, it definitely, like, I feel that because I feel the more, like you're saying, the more that you know, like, it's kind of like practice, you know, the more that you like, actually think about it, you're, like, training your brain to think a certain way, to understand, like, what's appreciation versus what is taking from another culture. And that kind of, and you kind of mentioned, like, the media already, but how often do you think that we see just appropriation in the media, and how can that be fixed with, you know, how do you educate someone who has a huge platform and who's just, you know, kind of appropriating from multiple different cultures?
Mhm. Yeah, so we've seen so many times culture appropriated. Like, I mean, if we want to use Kim Kardashian for an example, she's done it multiple times, and one of the most recent times was her shapewear line with the naming it kimono shapewear or solution wear, I think. But either way, she named it kimono, you know, and it was supposed to be like a play off of her name, and she went and got it trademarked and everything, or tried to. But it's the some simple research would have, you know, caused her not to do anything like that. And so and honestly, even in doing something like that, maybe if you had acknowledged the culture that it comes from and have people who are actually a part of that culture be a part of that brand, you know, that would show the world that you're not appropriating, but you are appreciating because you're understanding what the significance is of this, but you're also bringing in people who are from that culture. And it's not I think the important thing too is your reasons for doing it. Like, especially when you are somebody who's famous, you know, like, why would you need to incorporate people into this to make it a part of your brand? Well, I'm not trying to make money off of it. Instead, I am shedding light on a situation, or, you know, bringing awareness to a group of people, maybe giving someone else a platform that doesn't usually get a platform. So I think those are, when it comes to big people in the media, personally, it's all a personal thing. Like, how much education are you doing? And what are your reasons for doing this? Like, why does this have to be called the kimono, for example, you know?
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point in that it's not that it's not that we're saying that she can't, you know, call it kimono. She maybe still could have, if you're, like you're saying, she included people from that culture, which kind of leads us to another point that we were talking about, is the appreciating of other cultures and kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like appreciating the cultures so that not that you assimilate so that they're the same, but that you can take things from each other in a respectful way and kind of honor it instead of abusing it.
Mm-hmm. So it's almost like a cultural exchange,
Yeah.
where you both are kind of using things of one another's culture in your own. But I feel like that also is kind of a gray area, because still everyone may not be okay with it. And I think it also just matters how you go about doing whatever it is that you're doing. Like if you're wearing a dashiki, but you're not African American or of African descent, sometimes you have the argument that's like, well, I have spent time in Africa. Like I've met people, this was gifted to me. And I feel like that's kind of a cultural exchange kind of situation where it's more acceptable because you actually have gone into these communities and you have spent the time and it was gifted to you, So what are you to do? Like you want to wear it to show that you're thankful for what you have. So I think everything really boils down to motives and the reasons for why you do things. And even with the kimono example, because I did want to talk about that really briefly, incorporating someone of that culture in with your brand or your product, whatever it is, isn't going to stop the cultural appropriation. It has to be something that's done out of consciousness and something that's done for a reason. Like Kim Kardashian can't just incorporate people of Asian cultures because she wants to name her shape her line kimono. Like, no, how is this benefiting people of Asian descent? Like how are they actually benefiting from what your product is? And if there is nothing that's beneficial, then it's still a form of appropriation, So I think you have to do the work. You have to make sure you do the work behind it. And you can't just do something for the sake of saying, oh, I know because I read a book. Like, no, that's not going to work. People are going to know what your motives are. They're going to be very obvious.
And it kind of like you said, you have to know you have to do the work. So how can someone like me do the work for myself, but also for other people? Because like I said, you talked about like educating our children or educating different people, but what do you see as like the future of moving forward, kind of like away from appropriation? Like in a perfect world, what could I do? What could different people do to kind of get us to a point of appreciation and not this ill-motivated appropriation?
So actually, before we get into that question, let's go back a little bit and talk about why cultural appropriation is a problem and why it hurts and hinders communities that are being appropriated. So the first thing, or there are so many different reasons, but I came up with like 4 really big reasons that I feel like are kind of like the main reasons why cultural appropriation is a problem. So the first one would be because it makes things that are sacred to a culture cool for white people and unprofessional or too ethnic for people of color. Because the standard of beauty has always been whiteness in America since the beginning of existence, things belonging to Black people and Black culture are often seen as too Black or unprofessional, like hair, for example. Although our hair naturally grows coily and curly out of our scalps, it's looked down on in workplaces specifically. We style them in braids and it's too ghetto. We put them in Bantu knots and it's not professional. But the minute white people wear braids or Bantu knots, it's acceptable. It becomes a fashion statement. It's on runways and in magazines. And so, the important thing in that is to highlight that it's a choice for you to wear your hair like that, but it's not a choice for me. And I actually have to have laws in place to protect me so I don't lose my job for how I look, when I wake up or when I was born. Next, it trivializes violent historical oppression. So to use the hair example, when you wear your hair in braids, it diminishes the fact that Black women's heads were shaved when they were forced onto slave ships in the 1600s to strip them of their beauty and familiarity to the land. This is important because that trauma has carried on for generations and is the reason Black women began chemically straightening their hair to try to erase that pain that they've been dealing with and to fit into society, society that was being told that they weren't good enough or that their looks weren't good enough. And this isn't to harp on slavery, but it's to stress the importance of not appropriating culture and how you erase a culture's historical past in the simple decision to take something from that culture. Next, it lets people show love to the culture while continuing to hate its people. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we see all the time. Meanwhile, the people it's stolen from receive no credit or no acknowledgement of their contribution to the culture as a whole. And they still tend to suffer from the systematic oppression and racism. So people take things, benefiting off of them, finding new ways to look cool or make money while still looking down on the people and hating the community or culture that it comes from. And finally, it perpetuates racist stereotypes. So if your sorority throws an ethnicity-themed party and you all show up dressed how you believe people in that ethnicity dress, not only is that just plain racist because you're showing us what you think of that group of people, but it's giving life to those hateful stereotypes that exist around that ethnicity.
And so because of all of these things, there's so many different ways, like you said, these are just 4 ways that you really felt cultural appropriation hurts and hinders different cultures. So what can we do in all of our different positions to make us better about cultural appropriation and make us more aware and knowledgeable? And what can we do to make other people more aware and more knowledgeable? Because like I said, I didn't even know what it was, and that's a problem. Like, I should know, and so should other people. So how can we move forward from this?
Yeah. So we've talked about, education a lot. I think education is probably going to be the basis of everything. Educating ourselves on a culture, getting to know the difficulties that a culture deals with, getting to know the systems that are in place that continuously oppress those cultures. Because like we've mentioned earlier, more than likely, the cultural appropriation is coming from a more powerful group to a more marginalized group and taking things from a more marginalized group. So you have to educate yourselves and you have to know everything. It's a really big task to ask, but it's a really necessary task to ask because it's just good to know things about different cultures in general, but especially if you ever find yourself wanting to, wear bamboo earrings, for example, don't just go online and learn the history of those bamboo earrings, but understand the people whose culture those bamboo earrings belong to and what their regular lives entail. Also, get to know people of different cultures. It's one thing to just educate yourself and, to read books or to go online and Google. That's all really great. But who do you actually know that belongs to those cultures? Don't strike up a conversation for the sake of being able to wear your cornrows guilt-free. Really become friends with people of different backgrounds and hear them when they talk so that you really become familiar with cultures outside of your own. We've talked about appreciation. That's a really big part of it. You have to appreciate a culture. You have to understand that there are things that just belong to a group of people and are simply off limits. And you can't argue about it. That's it. They're off limits. And I think that's the important part of appreciation, is understanding the things that you just simply cannot do. Next, don't make a mockery and make fun of things that belong to a different culture. That's a really big one when it comes to Halloween and dressing up, as something that is, or dressing up in something that's really sacred to another culture. It's making a mockery. And that, honestly, I feel like is probably why a lot of people have a problem with appropriating culture. Aside from the reasons why they hinder a culture, you're simply making fun of us, And so I think that also ties into appreciation. Once you learn the significance of these things, you develop an appreciation for it, and that that's not cool. You can't just do something to make fun of. And finally, don't throw things back into the face of people belonging to the culture that you're appropriating out of defense. That's weak and it's insensitive. And quite frankly, it proves just why cultural appropriation is a problem.
And that makes so much more sense now too, like as we have this conversation, because I came into this thinking, how can I, appreciate cultures more? And also you bring up a really good point that there are some things that are just off limits. And how would you define these like off limit types of things? And like what would be the best route for me to kind of figure out what they are? Would I just simply ask like one person of the culture? Or should I get like what's the word? Like a sampling of multiple people, because like you said, what you think might be culturally appropriating, someone else might not. So what would be the best course of action for someone like me who wants to be better in this area?
So that's a great question because not everyone receives things the same way. So not everyone of that culture may feel like you're appropriating culture, but you have to stay mindful that it's not that those people's opinions don't matter, but if you still have anyone from that culture saying that they do feel like you are appropriating and you are taking something, that's the voice that you have to become aware of. And that's the voice that has to be in your head whenever you decide, that you want to do something. So for me, whenever I see things that I know isn't American, or isn't African American and something that belongs to one of those two cultures, I'm always trying to do more research about what that thing is before I wear it or before I even purchase it, to be honest. Because, oftentimes we'll go into like stores and we'll see things that are like, oh my God, this is so cute. I love the print or I love the color. Yeah, it's so cute. Like, but if it's something that looks it belongs to a culture, if it's something that looks cultural, and I don't want to say that to sound offensive or anything, but I feel like you can just tell when you see things that possibly belong to a specific culture. And so when I see things like that, I always kind of take a step back and I'm like, that me wearing this is going to signify something that I have no business signifying, So I always take the time to do a little bit more research into what that thing is. Or maybe if I feel like it belongs to a certain culture, I'll go and research that culture and try to figure out, like things that are important to them, things that are sacred to them. And even though I might not find the answer for what that thing is that I was looking at, I'm now still aware and educated on a culture. And now I know things for going forward, if that makes any sense, No. So I think it still comes down to education, taking the time to educate yourself and, figuring out what things are sacred. Like you said, if you have a friend or know people who belong to specific cultures and you have just a question about something, there's no harm in asking, because that's how we grow, that's how we evolve. And we're allowed to do that. We're allowed to grow and evolve. We're allowed to learn about other cultures. That's what makes us better, to know about the people who are around us, So just with that education, you will then begin to learn like what specific things mean, maybe what these sculptures mean or what symbols mean, and you'll know whether or not you can use them.
Absolutely. I think you just kind of summed up everything that we talked about today. Just what cultural appropriation is, how it hurts, why people don't know, and just this constant idea of educating ourselves and being better. And there's so many different sources of education too. I think like that's another really big point that we just need to touch on a little bit, is the fact that like we can ask our friends, we can reach out to different people. We have the internet, there are books. So I think that it comes down to just really understanding like what this is and how we can be better in so many different ways. And for the people that we care about around us, I just think that it's so important.
Exactly. And I love that you said care, because that's exactly what I was thinking. If you care about people, if you care about how someone else feels, even if it's somebody that you don't know, you'll take the time to do the work. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Let's Talk SU, which is our final episode. Thanks for sticking with us this season, and please stay tuned for more content from the Orange Television Network.